Welcome to The Explainer. We're diving into a story today about a war that China technically won, but in the process, the government actually lost the country. It's an incredible story of how the Second Sino-Japanese War didn't just save China, it completely turned it on its head. I mean, think about it. How can you win a war, but lose your entire country? It's a huge paradox, right? And that's really the central question we're tackling today. This brutal 8-year conflict was, on paper, a victory for China. But what it really did was set the stage for one of the country's two main powers to just completely collapse, while the other rose up to take it all. All right, so let's get right into it. To really wrap our heads around this, we've got to rewind the clock to 1937. You see, the tension between China and a very ambitious expansionist Japan had been simmering for decades, and it was just about to boil over. Yet this thing did not come out of nowhere. Not at all. Japan had been chipping away at Chinese territory for years, for decades, really. They grabbed Manchuria back in 1931, and after that, the writing was on the wall. So when the Marco Polo Bridge incident happened in July of 37, well, that was just the spark. It was the excuse Japan was looking for to go all in. But here's the kicker. The China that Japan invaded was a mess. It was a nation completely divided against itself. You had the Kuomintang, or the GMD, that was the official government, the nationalists, led by Jiang Jiechi, and then you had the Chinese Communist Party, the CCP, led by Mao Zedong. These two groups had been locked in a brutal civil war. But now, with a foreign invader at the gates, they patched together this very shaky truce called the Second United Front. And Japan did not waste any time. Their army was way more technologically advanced, and they just unleashed this blitzkrieg. They swept right down China's eastern coast, and by 1938, just a year later, they'd captured pretty much all the major cities, all the economic centers. This massive push forced the nationalist government to abandon its capital and flee, retreating way, way into the country's interior. Okay, and this is where the story gets really interesting. Because even though the GMD and the CCP were supposed to be allies, right? They were fighting the same enemy, but they fought this war in two completely different ways. And those different approaches would have huge, dramatically different consequences for their futures. So you had the nationalists, who were the official army. They took the fight to the Japanese head on. We're talking massive, conventional battles for control of cities, railways. They were fighting for every single inch of ground. The communists, on the other hand, they played it differently. They just kind of melted into the countryside, avoided those big, pitched battles, and instead waged a classic guerrilla war, getting the local peasants to help them disrupt and harass the Japanese. And if you want a perfect example of how costly the GMD strategy was, just look at the battle for Shanghai in 1937. It was an absolutely brutal 3-month slugfest, and it ended in just catastrophic losses for the nationalist army. Now, don't get me wrong, they showed incredible bravery, incredible resilience, but the cost, wow. They lost their best-trained troops and China's most important financial hub. Meanwhile, the communists were playing a completely different game. Out in the vast countryside where Japan couldn't really maintain control, the CCP was busy expanding its influence. And get this, they weren't just fighting, they were governing. They brought in popular reforms like reducing rents and taxes, they organized local militias, they made sure the Red Army was seen as a protector of the people. So while the GMD was bleeding out, losing soldiers and cities, the communists were winning the battle for hearts and minds. And we have to talk about the sheer brutality of this war. It was just staggering. After the nationalists were forced to pull out of their capital, Nanjing, Japanese troops swept in and unleashed an absolute reign of terror that lasted for 6 weeks. The number is just horrifying to even say. An estimated 300,000 civilians and unarmed soldiers were massacred. The horror of what happened there, which became known as the Rape of Nanjing, sent shockwaves around the world. In an event like this, it does two things. First, it shows the absolute savagery of the invading army. But second, and this is crucial for our story, it painfully showed everyone that the nationalist government was just powerless to protect its own people. For years, China was fighting this war pretty much on its own. So let's look at how this isolated conflict finally got pulled into the huge vortex of World War II, because that changed everything for everybody involved. So by 1940, things had kind of ground to a stalemate. Japan controlled the valuable coast with all the industry, but they just couldn't conquer the rest of the country. China is just too big, and the resistance was too scattered. So for years, China fought on, getting almost no outside help. But then, December 1941, Japan attacks Pearl Harbor. And just like that, everything changed. Suddenly, China wasn't fighting alone anymore. It was a crucial ally for the United States. And America started pouring in tons of military and financial aid to keep China in the fight, to tie down Japanese troops. But, and this is a really big but, almost all of that aid went to one place: Jiang Jiexi's official nationalist government. And this is such a critical point, so listen up. While the nationalists are getting all these American guns and all this money, what were the communists doing? They were busy winning the real war, the battle for the hearts and minds of the Chinese people.
It was like two different Chinas were existing at the same time. In the areas the GMD controlled, they were just printing money like crazy to fund the war, which led to insane hyperinflation that totally wiped out the savings of the middle class. And for the peasants, brutal forced conscription and crushing taxes. It was a disaster. Compare that to the communist-held areas, where they were doing the exact opposite. They cultivated support by cutting taxes and making sure their army was seen as protectors, not predators. And this wasn't some big secret either. The GMD's corruption and just plain incompetence were so bad that it wasn't just the Chinese people who were fed up. Even their American allies, the ones footing the bill, were getting frustrated. The nationalist government was seen as totally inept and honestly more interested in hoarding power and wealth than in actually fighting Japan or taking care of its people. So, fast forward to 1945. The war against Japan finally ends, and China is officially on the winning side. Huzzah, right? Well, not exactly, because inside China, the balance of power had been completely upended. The war with Japan was over, but a new, and maybe even more important, war was just about to begin. Yeah, the atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki brought the whole of World War II to a sudden, shocking end, and that included the war in China. So after 8 incredibly long, brutal years and millions upon millions of deaths, China was, at last, victorious. But just look at what happened under the surface during those 8 years. While the nationalists were taking the brunt of the Japanese attacks, getting bled dry on the front lines, the communists were brilliantly using the chaos to grow. I mean, check out these numbers. They started the war with just 40,000 members. By the end, over 1.2 million. That is one of the most staggering political expansions you'll ever see. You know, there's this quote from the historian Emmanuel Hu that just hits the nail on the head. He said the GMD was so depleted physically and spiritually that it just couldn't handle the challenges that came after the war. And that's it, exactly. The nationalists won the war on paper, but in reality, they were exhausted, they were broke, and they had lost all credibility with their own people. They fought the war, sure, but they had already lost the peace before it even started. And that leaves us with one last, kinda provocative question to think about. The war against Japan was an unbelievable national tragedy for China, no doubt about it. But did it also create the perfect storm for a revolution? It absolutely crippled the ruling nationalists, while at the very same time, it empowered the communists beyond their wildest dreams. So when Japan finally surrendered, it didn't really bring peace to China. It just cleared the stage for the final act of the Chinese Civil War, a war that, you could argue, had already been decided.